History's rarely written by the men who stand in the glaring light of the public stage, waving from the balconies of power to the endlessly marching crowds below. The grand official narratives of the 20th century are largely composed of carefully curated myths, monuments forged from steel, concrete, and state-sanctioned lies. To truly understand the anatomy of a vanished empire, one must look away from the illuminated podiums and peer into the shadows. One must look to the periphery. The truest architects and the most accurate chroniclers of history are the invisible people. They are the ones who stand silently in the background of faded photographs, holding a heavy coat, opening a heavy car door, watching the world unfold through the narrow, rectangular frame of a rearview mirror. For 40 years, a frozen river of silence covered the deepest secrets of the Soviet elite. For 4 decades, the truth remained locked inside a human vault, hidden away from the prying eyes of historians and the relentless passage of time. But ice eventually cracks. On November 13, 2024, the impossible happened. The last living witness of an era defined by whispers and shadows finally broke his solemn vow. An old man, fragile in body but possessing a memory as sharp and unforgiving as a scalpel, decided to shatter almost half a century of absolute silence. His name is Alexander Rebenko. To the uninitiated, to the casual consumer of history, he was a nobody. He was merely a driver, a logistical necessity, a ghost assigned to ferry the most powerful men in the world from one secret location to another. But to those who understand the true hidden mechanics of a totalitarian regime, Alexander Rebenko is a living, breathing archive of monumental importance. He is the ultimate repository of the darkest, most fiercely guarded secrets of a fallen superpower. For years, he served as the personal driver, the silent confessor, and the invisible shadow to Leonid Brezhnev. This narrative is not a mere biographical sketch. It is a meticulous historical investigation, a documentary detective story delving into the psychological ruins of a political titan. It is a forensic examination of the contrast between the benevolent, grandfatherly facade presented to the Soviet public and the ruthless, cynical reality of power. But to understand the master, one must first understand the instrument he used. One must understand how a human being is stripped of his humanity to become a perfect reflection of the state's will. The Soviet apparatus was globally feared for its military might and its sprawling intelligence networks, but its most terrifying and magnificent engineering achievements were not rockets or submarines. They were wrought in the human soul. The system required servants who were not just loyal, but profoundly, fundamentally empty. Alexander Rebenko was not born to be the keeper of the General Secretary's secrets. He was systematically and ruthlessly manufactured for the role. Let us rewind the tape of history to his humble beginnings, for therein lies the genius of the state's psychological profiling. Who makes the ideal confidant for a political operator climbing the treacherous, blood-stained ladders of the Soviet hierarchy? It cannot be a friend, for friends harbor their own secret ambitions and resentments. It cannot be a relative, for families are tangled webs of leverage and emotional vulnerability. The perfect servant is a complete void. Alexander Rebenko was born into the vast anonymous ranks of the working class, but his most defining characteristic, his most valuable asset in the eyes of the state, was that he was an orphan. In the cold, cynical calculus of the Committee for State Security, the organization known to the world as the KGB, an orphan was the purest, most exquisite raw material available. An orphan possesses no earthly attachments. An orphan has no loyalties divided between the warmth of a mother's love and the cold demands of the motherland. If an orphan suddenly disappears in the middle of the night, no desperate family will weep at the imposing gates of the Lubyanka prison. No father will write impassioned, futile letters to the Central Committee demanding answers. An orphan is a pristine, untouched blank slate upon which the omnipotent state can write its absolute, unyielding will. The intelligence recruiters, men with eyes like dead winter lakes, found Alexander when he was young, malleable, and subconsciously yearning for a sense of belonging. The totalitarian machine approached him and offered an incredibly seductive, inescapable proposition. We will be your family, your mother, your father, and your God. We will give you a purpose greater than yourself. But the price of this glorious adoption was the complete, irrevocable surrender of his individual identity. He was not chosen for his intellectual brilliance, although he possessed a sharp, observant mind. He was not selected for his physical prowess, although he was tough and resilient. He was chosen for his extraordinary capacity to become absolutely nothing. He was chosen because the psychological evaluators recognized in him the rare ability to erase his own ego. The selection and training process was a labyrinthine nightmare of psychological conditioning, designed to systematically strip away every single vestige of normal human reaction. Imagine a rigorous training academy hidden deep within the forests, a place where you are immediately stripped of your given name. You are no longer Alexander. You are completely dehumanized. You become cadet number 47. You sleep in a sterile barracks with other numbers. You eat your meager rations with other numbers. You undergo grueling physical training with other numbers, yet you remain utterly, agonizingly alone. Trust is a luxury that has been permanently confiscated. The curriculum in this shadow academy was not merely about mastering evasive driving maneuvers on icy roads or learning how to detect a sophisticated surveillance tail in heavy traffic. Those were merely technical skills. The true curriculum was the systematic destruction of the self. The cadets were taught the agonizing art of seeing without looking, of hearing without listening, of absorbing every single detail of a room while projecting an aura of complete and utter incomprehension. The instructors, faceless men in impeccably tailored gray suits who spoke in soft, menacing tones, subjected the cadets to endless, grueling psychological evaluations. They relentlessly tested their breaking points. They monitored their heart rates and breathing patterns during staged, intense interrogations. They placed the young men in quiet rooms where whispered, highly treasonous conversations were deliberately staged just outside the door. The instructors watched from behind two-way mirrors, waiting to see if a cadet would react, if the microscopic twitch of an eye or the sudden stiffening of a posture would betray that they understood the political heresy being spoken. Alexander excelled in this unnatural environment because he mastered the ultimate survival tactic of the totalitarian world, the absolute impenetrable blankness of the soul. He learned to swallow his natural reactions, to bury his emotions so incredibly deep within his psyche that eventually even he could no longer find them. He became a master of the vacant stare. He learned to become a piece of furniture, a man who could blend seamlessly into the leather upholstery of a government limousine. The regime understood a fundamental, fatal flaw in human nature, the desperate, burning urge to share, to gossip, to confess what one knows. The driver to the highest echelons of power would inevitably hear the quiet murmurs of grand conspiracies, the exhausted sighs of men deciding the fate of millions, the bitter, venomous complaints plotted against political rivals. If the driver were a normal, feeling man, the sheer gravitational weight of these secrets would crush his sanity, or worse, tempt him to trade that information for personal gain. Therefore, the state ensured he was no longer a normal man. He was transformed into an impenetrable vault, a vault where the combination was held exclusively by his master. Then came the dark culmination of this psychological metamorphosis, the final initiation. It was not a grand celebratory ceremony, adorned with shining medals and red banners fluttering in the wind. It was a suffocatingly quiet, deeply intimidating ritual held in a sterile, brightly illuminated room, located deep within the subterranean levels of the intelligence headquarters. It was here, surrounded by the hum of ventilation shafts and the smell of floor wax, that Alexander took what was known among the terrified whispers of the elite as the blood oath of the void. There was no physical violence involved in this initiation. The regime had long since evolved beyond the crude, messy methods of the past. The violence inflicted upon Alexander was entirely metaphysical. He was presented with a document. To call it a simple non-disclosure agreement would be a profound, laughable understatement. It was a binding contract of absolute ownership over his past, his present, and his entire future. The high-ranking officer sitting across the metal desk did not shout or threaten him with raised fists. He spoke in a soft, eminently reasonable, and utterly terrifying monotone. He explained with chilling bureaucratic clarity that from the very moment the ink dried on the paper, Alexander Rebenko ceased to exist as a private citizen of the world. He became a classified asset of the state. He was informed that any breach of this sacred silence, any stray, careless word spoken while dreaming in his sleep, any desperate confession written in a hidden diary, would be considered an act of supreme high treason. The ultimate penalty was not explicitly stated to be physical execution, for the concept of death was almost too ordinary. The penalty was complete historical erasure. The state would simply and efficiently correct the clerical error of his existence. He would be unpersoned. His photographs would be altered, his records incinerated, his memory eradicated from the minds of anyone who ever knew him. He would simply evaporate into the cold Russian air. This profound existential threat was the psychological mechanism that guaranteed his absolute, unwavering loyalty. This loyalty was not built on the flimsy foundation of political ideology. Ideology can be debated, ideology can fracture, and ideology can fade over time. His loyalty was built on the elemental, primal fear of non-existence coupled with the paradoxical, twisted comfort of being entirely consumed and directed by a higher, omnipotent power. Alexander picked up the pen and signed his name. With those deliberate strokes of ink, he sealed his lips tight for 4 long decades. He accepted the monumental, soul-crushing burden of becoming the ultimate witness who could never, under any circumstances, testify. The analytical and historical value of understanding Alexander's genesis is truly staggering. We as a society often analyze totalitarian and authoritarian systems purely through the macro lens of their visible leaders, their grand economic 5-year plans, or the menacing hardware displayed in their military parades. But the true, terrifying essence of such a regime is revealed in the microscopic details of how it crafts its human instruments. The meticulous creation of Alexander Rebenko exposes the horrifying, flawless perfection of the Soviet control apparatus. It powerfully demonstrates that the ultimate supreme power of the totalitarian state is not merely the ability to kill its enemies, but the profound ability to unmake a human being from the inside out. It is the power to hollow out a living soul and fill the empty vessel with nothing but blind duty, paralyzing fear, and eternal silence. For decades, dedicated historians and journalists have desperately tried to piece together the complex puzzle of the Soviet era. They have relied on heavily redacted, heavily censored documents and the self-serving, sanitized memoirs of politicians. They have spent all their time staring intensely at the actors on the stage, completely ignoring the silent stagehands who rigged the lights and pulled the strings. But now, the stagehand is finally speaking. The impenetrable vault has opened its heavy doors. The invisible ghost has materialized into flesh and bone. On November 13th, 2024, Alexander Rebenko looked directly into the lens of the camera. His ancient eyes carried the heavy, dusty, suffocating weight of classified history. With a voice that was quiet but steady, he finally began to unpack the invisible luggage of his extraordinary life. He's ready to guide us through the treacherous labyrinth of smoke and mirrors. He's ready to tear down the facade and show us the real man hiding behind the famously heavy eyebrows and the chest weighed down by unearned medals. He's preparing to take us back in time, back to the turbulent 1950s, to the industrial city of Dnipropetrovsk. That is where the dark seeds of a vast shadow empire were first planted in the fertile soil of ambition. The suffocating era of silence is officially over. The greatest historical investigation of our time has just begun. The industrial heartland of the Soviet Union in the early 1950s was a landscape of smoke, steel, and suffocating paranoia. To the outside observer, the city of Dnipropetrovsk was merely another cog in the vast, relentless machinery of post-war reconstruction. However, beneath the gray sky and the towering chimneys of the metallurgical plants, a different kind of industry was quietly booming. It was the clandestine industry of political survival and calculated ambition. In this grim utilitarian theater, the heavy curtain rose on the second act of our documentary, Detective Story. It was here, amidst the roar of factories and the whispered rumors of party purges, that Alexander Rebenko, the perfectly engineered human void, was finally assigned to his master. The year was 1951. Joseph Stalin was still alive, casting a long, terrifying, and paralyzing shadow over the entire Soviet Empire. Survival in the political ranks required the cunning of a fox and the cold-blooded patience of a reptile. Enter Leonid Brezhnev. History, in its later, lazier chapters, would paint him as a doddering, grandfatherly figure, a man obsessed with shiny metals and public embraces. But the Brezhnev of 1951 was an entirely different creature. He was a sharp, hungry, and remarkably charismatic regional party leader. He possessed a dangerously disarming smile, a firm handshake, and eyes that constantly calculated the hidden value of every person he met. When the young, silent driver was first introduced to the rising party boss, the air in the cramped, smoke-filled office was heavy with unspoken tension. Brezhnev did not greet Alexander with warmth. Instead, he subjected him to a profound, unnerving psychological audit. This was the first true test of the driver's cultivated blindness and deafness. Brezhnev deliberately left highly classified dossiers open on the back seat of his official vehicle. He intentionally engaged in dangerously provocative conversations with his closest aides while Alexander navigated the treacherous, unpaved roads of the provincial region. Through it all, the young driver remained an absolute statue of stone. His eyes never drifted to the rearview mirror. His breathing never hitched when the names of powerful, dangerous men were casually tossed into the air like burning matches. He was a piece of the leather upholstery. He was the steering wheel. He was nothing more than an operational component of the state machine. After 3 agonizing weeks of this relentless, silent testing, Brezhnev finally relaxed. He had found his perfect shadow. The rising star of the party realized that he now possessed an invaluable asset, a mobile, secure, and completely invisible fortress. In the paranoid architecture of Soviet power, brick and mortar offices were inherently compromised. The walls truly had ears, wired by the ever-watchful state security apparatus. Phones were tapped, secretaries were informants, and even the heavy velvet curtains might conceal a listening device. Therefore, Brezhnev ingeniously transformed his state-issued automobile into a clandestine mobile headquarters. The heavy black metal of the vehicle became the physical boundary of his shadow empire. It was within the confined, moving sanctuary of this car that Alexander Rebenko witnessed the true Machiavellian genius of his patron. The public Brezhnev stood on wooden tribunes passionately lecturing the exhausted workers about the glorious, inevitable triumph of communist ideals. The private Brezhnev, however, sat in the back seat of his car, methodically weaving a vast, invisible web of mutual obligations, secret favors, and carefully collected vulnerabilities. The vehicle became a sanctuary for the disgraced and the politically vulnerable. Under the cover of total darkness, Alexander would drive to remote, unlit corners of the industrial city to pick up men whose careers hung by a fragile, fraying thread. These were officials who had made minor ideological errors, managers who had failed to meet impossible production quotas, or men who had simply crossed the wrong superior. In the quiet isolation of the idling car, Brezhnev did not offer them Marxist rhetoric. He offered them salvation. He offered them absolute protection. In exchange for this protection, he demanded something far more valuable than mere gratitude. He demanded total, unquestioning personal loyalty, and he demanded information. He was building an informal, subterranean network of loyalists. He was collecting political dirt, known in the cynical lexicon of the apparatus as compromat. The driver, pretending to be utterly deaf, memorized every whispered confession, every desperate plea, and every cynical bargain struck in the darkness. He realized that his master was not serving the state. His master was slowly, deliberately building a state within the state. The stakes of this invisible game were incredibly high, and the methods employed were ruthlessly efficient. This brings us to a chilling episode that completely shattered any remaining illusions the young driver might have harbored about the benevolent nature of his boss. It was the year 1954. The political landscape was undergoing a massive seismic shift following the demise of the supreme leader. Factions were clashing in Moscow, and the tremors were felt all the way down to the regional offices in Dnipropetrovsk. A prominent local figure, the deputy chairman of the city executive committee, had become a dangerous obstacle to Brezhnev's expanding influence. This official was a stubborn, inflexible man who refused to play by the unwritten rules of the shadow economy of favors. He possessed documents that could potentially embarrass Brezhnev's carefully cultivated network. The situation required a swift, decisive, and entirely silent resolution. There was no dramatic midnight arrest by armed guards. There were no loud accusations in the town square. The elimination of the obstacle was handled with the terrifying bureaucratic elegance of a disappearing act. One rainy evening, Alexander was instructed to drive the deputy chairman to a supposedly urgent confidential meeting on the outskirts of the region. The man entered the vehicle, clutching a leather briefcase full of righteous indignation and dangerous facts. The journey was long and silent. When they reached a desolate, heavily forested crossroad, another vehicle was waiting. Two men in unmarked, tailored coats stepped out into the freezing rain. The deputy chairman was politely but firmly instructed to transfer to the other car for the remainder of his journey. He looked at Brezhnev, who sat comfortably in the front passenger seat, smoking a cigarette and staring blankly through the wet windshield. The party boss did not say a single word. He simply offered a small, sympathetic nod. The deputy chairman stepped out into the mud. The other car drove away, its taillights bleeding into the thick, suffocating fog. That man was never seen in the city again. His name was quietly removed from the directory. His office was immediately reassigned. He was not physically harmed, for overt violence was the crude, messy tool of amateurs. He was simply erased from the board. He was transferred to an obscure, meaningless post in a frozen, forgotten corner of the vast Siberian expanse, his career effectively buried alive under an avalanche of administrative paperwork. Sitting behind the steering wheel, his hands gripping the cold plastic, Alexander learned a profound, indelible lesson about the nature of power. True power was not loud. It was not boastful. True power was the remarkable ability to make a human being vanish without spilling a single drop of blood, without raising a single voice, simply by shifting the invisible gears of the bureaucratic machine. This period in Dnipropetrovsk served as the ultimate school of the conspirator. It is an era that holds immense analytical value for anyone attempting to deconstruct the anatomy of political dominance. The carefully constructed state-sponsored image of Leonid Brezhnev as a simple, good-natured, and fiercely loyal servant of the Communist Party was perhaps the greatest, most successful disguise of the 20th century. It was a brilliant, highly effective mask worn by a deeply cynical, relentlessly calculating operator. The narrative of the kindly leader was a necessary fiction designed to lull his rivals into a false, fatal sense of security, while older, more established politicians underestimated him. Viewing him as a cheerful, harmless functionary, Brezhnev was methodically laying the foundation for an impenetrable fortress of personal influence. He understood that ideology was a hollow vessel, a beautiful, fragile shell that easily shattered under the immense pressure of human greed and fear. He realized that the true currency of the Soviet realm was not the ruble, nor was it the inspirational slogans printed on red banners. The true currency was leverage. It was the knowledge of a colleague's secret indiscretion. It was the ability to protect a frightened subordinate. It was the quiet, unspoken promise of a promotion in exchange for absolute, blind obedience. By turning his state vehicle into a mobile confessional and a rolling command center, he managed to bypass the official, heavily monitored channels of communication. He operated entirely in the shadows, building a vast, interconnected web of debts and loyalties that would eventually serve as the springboard for his astonishing leap to the absolute pinnacle of power. The men he saved in the darkness of 1951 would become the loyal generals of his political army a decade later. The compromat he patiently gathered while riding over bumpy, unpaved roads would become the devastating ammunition he would later use to neutralize his most dangerous enemies in the grand halls of the Kremlin. Alexander Rebenko, the invisible witness, absorbed all of this. He was receiving a master class in the dark arts of political survival. He watched as his patron transformed from a regional player into a grand master of the political chessboard. The young driver learned that morality was a luxury that ambitious men simply could not afford. He learned that every smile was a strategic calculation, every favor was a carefully baited trap, and every whispered secret was a loaded weapon waiting to be fired at the precise, perfect moment. The school of the conspirator had profoundly changed them both. The master had sharpened his instincts, realizing that his ultimate destiny lay far beyond the smoke-filled skies of the industrial provinces. The servant had perfected his invisibility, realizing that his own survival depended entirely on his ability to remain a silent, empty vessel. The Dnipropetrovsk years were not merely a stepping stone. They were the crucial crucible where the very soul of the future leader was forged. He learned that in a system built entirely on paranoia, the man who controls the secrets controls the future. He learned that alliances based on ideological purity were incredibly fragile, while alliances forged in the fires of mutual complicity were unbreakable. Every night spent parked in the hidden, unlit alleys of the city was a strategic investment in a future that only he could clearly envision. For the invisible driver, these years solidified his terrifying, silent compact with the universe. He was no longer just a man operating a machine. He was the trusted custodian of a dark, parallel reality. He was the keeper of the hidden ledger where every favor, every betrayal, and every secret was meticulously recorded. He knew that the man sitting in the back seat was destined for greatness, not because he was the most righteous or the most visionary, but simply because he was the most ruthless, the most patient, and the most profoundly adaptable predator in the political jungle. The long, dark road stretched out before them, leading away from the provincial factories and directly toward the glittering, dangerous spires of the capital city. The master of the Shadow Empire was finally ready to claim his ultimate prize, and the world was entirely unprepared for the quiet, devastating storm that was about to break. The transition from the provincial grit of the industrial heartland to the cold, neoclassical grandeur of Moscow was more than a change of geography. It was a descent into the very heart of the labyrinth. By the late 1950s, the political atmosphere in the capital was electrified with a deceptive sense of change. The thaw was underway, and the old guard was being cautiously dismantled. Yet beneath the surface of this supposed liberalization, a much more dangerous game was being played. Leonid Brezhnev arrived in Moscow not as a humble servant of the new order, but as a silent conqueror who had already mastered the art of the subterranean war. For Alexander Rebenko, the move to Moscow meant navigating a city where every street corner felt like a checkpoint and every grand building held 1,000 hidden eyes. The black government limousine, once a mobile office in the provinces, now became a stealthy predator stalking the corridors of supreme power. It was during this period that the driver witnessed the most chilling evolution of his master's strategy: the infiltration and instrumentalization of the secret police. Brezhnev understood a fundamental truth that his more idealistic or arrogant rivals ignored. The Communist Party held the title to the country, but the KGB held the keys to the skeletons in the closet. To rule the Soviet Union, one did not need the love of the masses. One needed the absolute control of the archives. This realization led to the frequent late-night journeys that Alexander Rebenko would never forget. Trips to the most feared address in the world, Number 2, Lubyanka Square. While other members of the Politburo avoided the headquarters of the secret police out of a lingering primal fear born in the Stalin era, Brezhnev treated the Lubyanka as his private library. Alexander would park the heavy vehicle in the secluded inner courtyard, a place where the air always felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the city. He would watch in the rearview mirror as Brezhnev adjusted his tie, smoothed his hair, and stepped out with the calm confidence of a man returning home. Inside those walls, Brezhnev was doing something far more sophisticated than simple spying. He was conducting a forensic audit of the Soviet elite. He cultivated deep, clandestine relationships with high-ranking officers who felt sidelined by the current leadership. He sought out the keepers of the black files, the dossiers containing the private sins, the financial irregularities, and the hidden family scandals of every prominent official in the empire. Alexander often observed the fruits of these nocturnal visits. Brezhnev would return to the car carrying a simple leather folder, his expression unreadable. During the long drives back to the government dacha, he would occasionally read aloud fragments of information to his trusted aides, his voice dripping with a terrifying, amused irony. He was learning who among his rivals had a weakness for Western luxuries, who was struggling with an alcoholic son, and who had expressed a private, fleeting doubt about the party line 20 years prior. This was the information as power doctrine in its purest form. Brezhnev wasn't looking for reasons to arrest his opponents. He was looking for reasons to own them. He understood that a dead rival is a martyr, but a compromised rival is a loyal servant for life. He was building a network of personal informants within the very structures meant to protect the state. One of the most critical components of this shadow network was the rise of the Dnepropetrovsk clan within the security services. Chief among them was Semyon Tsvigun, a man who would eventually become the first deputy chairman of the KGB and Brezhnev's most loyal hound. Alexander watched as these men, bound by the secrets they shared with Brezhnev from their provincial days, began to occupy key positions in the capital. They were a Praetorian Guard that operated outside the official chain of command. They didn't report to the state, they reported to the man in the back seat of Alexander's car. The analytical value of this period cannot be overstated. It reveals the architectural flaw of the Soviet system. Its total reliance on secrecy made it vulnerable to anyone who could monopolize that secrecy. Brezhnev was the first leader to treat the KGB not as a weapon of mass terror, but as a surgical tool for political management. He was the original architect of the deep state within the Soviet context, but the reach of his influence extended even further than the internal borders of the USSR. Through his growing control over the Lubyanka, Brezhnev gained access to the most sensitive reports of the First Chief Directorate, the Foreign Intelligence Wing. This gave him a godlike perspective that his peers in the Kremlin simply did not possess. While the rest of the Politburo relied on sanitized summaries and official diplomatic cables, Brezhnev was reading the raw, unvarnished intercepts of foreign leaders and the secret assessments of the Pentagon's long-term strategies. Alexander Rebenko recalls several instances where this high-level intelligence was used with devastating precision. On one occasion, during a tense internal meeting regarding trade relations with the West, a senior official proposed a strategy based on the assumption of American military posture. Brezhnev, with a small, knowing smile, interjected with a specific, highly classified detail about a recent secret debate within the United States National Security Council, information he should not have possessed. The room went silent. In that single moment, he demonstrated that he was not just a politician, he was the ultimate arbiter of reality. He didn't just have the facts, he had the secrets behind the facts. This access to external secrets served a dual purpose. Internationally, it allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of the Cold War with a cynical, pragmatic realism. Domestically, it made him appear omniscient. To his colleagues, it seemed as though Brezhnev possessed a supernatural intuition. In reality, he simply had a more efficient plumbing system for the flow of classified data. The driver's perspective during these years provides a unique window into the psychological transformation of the Soviet leadership. Alexander saw the transition from the frantic ideological zeal of the Khrushchev era to the cold, calculated stability of the Brezhnevian system. The car was no longer just a place of conspiracy. It was the nerve center of a silent coup d'etat that was taking place one file, one favor, and one compromise at a time. Brezhnev was winning because he played a game that his opponents didn't even realize was in progress. They were arguing about wheat yields and steel production in the bright light of the Central Committee halls. He was arguing about the price of silence in the dark recesses of the Lubyanka. He was neutralizing competitors by finding their personal weakness factor, a term Alexander heard used more than once. Whether it was a hidden health issue or a clandestine affair, every vulnerability was recorded, indexed, and stored for future use. The sheer scale of the network was breathtaking. By the early 1960s, Brezhnev had successfully placed his people in the military, the secret police, and the regional party organs. He had created a human web where every vibration was felt by him first. And at the center of this web, Alexander Rebenko sat behind the wheel, the silent witness to the quietest revolution in history. He watched as the golden youth of the elite began to flock to Brezhnev, sensing where the true gravity of power now lay. He saw the exchange of expensive Swiss watches and French perfumes in the back of the car, small symbolic gestures of a new era of corruption that would eventually define the stagnation. But in these early Moscow years, it wasn't called corruption. It was called mutual understanding. The analytical takeaway is clear. Brezhnev's rise was the victory of the manager over the visionary. He proved that in a closed system, the man who controls the internal flow of information will always defeat the man who tries to change the external world. He turned the Soviet Union into a giant, interconnected web of blackmail and patronage, where everyone owed something to someone else, and everyone eventually owed everything to him. As the decade turned, the driver could sense a change in his master's demeanor. The hunger of the provincial years had been replaced by a heavy, predatory patience. Brezhnev was no longer climbing the ladder. He was holding it, deciding who stayed on and who was kicked off. The path to Olympus was nearly complete. The invisible empire was fully operational, its agents embedded in every corner of the state, its files bursting with the weaknesses of the powerful. The stage was set for the final act of the takeover. The man who had started as a quiet driver's patron in Dnepropetrovsk was now the puppet master of the Kremlin. Alexander Rebenko, parked outside the grand state buildings, knew that the silence of the city was deceptive. Below the surface, the gears of the conspiracy were turning faster than ever. The phenomenon of silence had become the most powerful weapon in the world, and Leonid Brezhnev was finally ready to pull the trigger. The era of the General Secretary was about to begin, born not from the will of the people, but from the darkness of the archives and the unwavering silence of a driver who saw everything and said nothing. In the cold, clinical world of Soviet geopolitics, there was a persistent myth that the private lives of the great leaders were as sterile and disciplined as a military parade. The official propaganda portrayed the General Secretary as a man of iron domestic virtue, a tireless servant of the state whose only passion was the welfare of the proletariat. But from the driver's seat of the Black Zeal limousine, Alexander Rebenko saw a much more complex and fragile reality. He understood that the Kremlin was not just a fortress of political power, but a labyrinth of human frailty where the bedroom was often as influential as the boardroom, and where the heart was frequently used as a strategic asset. To understand the era of Leonid Brezhnev, one must look past the heavy curtains of the state dachas and into the fractured dynamics of his inner circle. Brezhnev's relationship with his family was a tragic mirror of the empire he governed, outwardly stable and imposing, but inwardly decaying under the weight of neglect, excess, and unresolved trauma. In this fourth chapter of our investigation, we examine the private man behind the public mask and how his personal life became a factor of national security. The foundation of Brezhnev's personal life was his wife, Victoria Petrovna. To the public, she was the quintessential Soviet matriarch, modest, unassuming, and perpetually in the shadow of her husband. But Alexander Rebenko remembers her as a woman of profound, dignified sadness. She was the anchor that Brezhnev had long ago pulled up and left behind. As he ascended the heights of the Moscow elite, he moved into a world of glamour and intrigue that Victoria could not or would not inhabit. She remained a ghost in the grand state apartments, a silent witness to her husband's increasing emotional distance. This vacuum was filled by a succession of women who were far more than mere romantic interests. In the cynical economy of the Kremlin, proximity was the ultimate currency, and the women in Brezhnev's life were the primary brokers of that currency. Alexander recalls the long, discreet drives to the outskirts of Moscow, to secluded guest houses where the official motorcade would wait in the darkness. There was the legendary connection with Nina Telman, and the whispers of a deep infatuation with the famous actress Lyubov Orlova. These women were not just companions. They were unofficial advisors and sophisticated channels of information. They possessed an intuitive understanding of the political landscape that many of the men in the Politburo lacked. They could whisper a name into the general secretary's ear during a moment of relaxation, and that name could either rise to the heights of a ministry or disappear into provincial obscurity. Brezhnev used these relationships as a psychological buffer against the crushing pressure of his office. He was a man who craved affirmation and emotional warmth, qualities that were in short supply in the sterile halls of the Central Committee. However, his enemies, the very men he had compromised with his black files, were not blind. They watched these romances with predatory interest. The driver saw how the KGB, even while being controlled by Brezhnev's loyalists, meticulously documented these affairs. In the high-stakes game of Soviet power, a mistress was not just a secret, she was a target. She was a point of entry for foreign intelligence or a lever for internal blackmail. But the true tragedy of the Brezhnev household lay not in his romantic entanglements, but in his children. If the Dnepropetrovsk clan represented the peak of his political engineering, his family represented its total failure. The most explosive element of this domestic drama was his daughter, Galina. To Alexander Rebenko, Galina Brezhneva was the living embodiment of the golden youth's moral collapse. She was a woman of wild, uncontrollable energy who felt suffocated by the rigid expectations of her father's position. She sought rebellion in the most dangerous places. Her life was a parade of scandalous marriages and high-profile affairs with circus performers and artists. But the most sinister chapter involved her connection to the so-called Diamond Mafia. Alexander recalls the increasing tension in the car whenever Galina's name was mentioned. She had become a liability that even the General Secretary's immense power could barely contain. Her involvement in the illicit trade of precious stones and antiques was an open secret among the elite. She used her father's name to bypass customs, to intimidate investigators, and to protect her criminal associates. The analytical value of Galina's behavior is profound. It demonstrates the beginning of the feudalization of the Soviet Union. The children of the elite began to view the state not as a cause to serve, but as a private estate to be plundered. Galina's scandals were not just tabloid fodder, they were systemic tremors. Every time she intervened to protect a black market smuggler, she weakened the very foundations of the rule of law that her father was supposed to uphold. She became a walking security breach, a woman whose personal whims could influence state policy and whose associates were often deep cover informants for rival factions within the security services. Then there was Yuri, Brezhnev's son. If Galina was a firestorm, Yuri was a dull, gray fog. He was a man of profound mediocrity, pushed into high-ranking positions in the Ministry of Foreign Trade solely because of his surname. Alexander saw Yuri frequently, a man who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the weight of his father's legacy, retreating into the quiet, slow suicide of alcoholism. Yuri represented the stagnant future of the empire, a leadership that was not earned through merit but inherited through blood, and which possessed neither the will nor the ability to govern. The driver's perspective reveals a chilling dynamic. Brezhnev, the master of secrets, was himself a prisoner of his family's indiscretions. He used the KGB to cover up Galina's crimes, and in doing so, he became indebted to the very apparatus he sought to command. The personal weakness factor that he had used so effectively against his rivals was now being used against him by his own flesh and blood. As the years progressed, the line between family life and state business blurred into non-existence. Decisions of monumental importance, appointments of ambassadors, allocations of state resources, even nuances of foreign policy, were often discussed over the dinner table, influenced by the complaints of a daughter or the needs of a mistress. The family as an instrument strategy had backfired. Instead of providing him with a loyal inner circle, it had created a theater of vulnerability. This erosion of personal boundaries had a devastating effect on Brezhnev's psyche. Alexander Rebenko watched through the rearview mirror as the general secretary's face grew increasingly weary. The man who could outmaneuver the most seasoned conspirators in the Kremlin was powerless to stop the self-destruction of his own children. He began to seek solace in a growing dependence on medication, sleeping pills and sedatives that were often supplied by his inner circle to keep him manageable. The analytical takeaway of this period is the concept of dynastic decay. Brezhnev's struggle with his family illustrates the inherent weakness of an autocracy. When power is concentrated in the hands of one man, his personal griefs, his daughter's scandals, and his son's failures become matters of existential importance for the entire state. The Diamond Mafia was not just a criminal enterprise, it was a symptom of a system where the elite had stopped believing in the future and had started hoarding the present. In the final years of this middle period, the driver noticed a shift in the tone of the conversations in the back of the ZL. There was less talk of grand strategies and more talk of containment. The invisible empire was now spending as much energy hiding its own rot as it was monitoring the rot of its enemies. The benevolent grandfather of the Soviet Union was, in reality, a man haunted by the knowledge that he was losing control of his own household. Alexander Rebenko, the silent record keeper, watched as the jewels on Galina's fingers and the empty bottles in Yuri's wake became the true symbols of the era. He realized that the empire would not fall because of a foreign invasion or an economic collapse alone. It would fall because the heart of the system had become a place of blackmail, disappointment, and moral exhaustion. The path to the summit had been won through the control of secrets. But now, the secrets were devouring the master. The stage was being set for the final transformation of the regime, from a dynamic conspiracy into a stagnant pharmacological autocracy, where the silence of the driver was the only thing left holding the facade together. The year 1964 stands as the most pivotal chapter in the secret history of the Soviet Union. It was the year the mask of collective leadership was torn away, revealing the cold, clockwork precision of a perfectly executed conspiracy. For Alexander Rebenko, this was the period when the car was no longer a mobile office or a private confessional. It became a rolling command center for a silent revolution. The target was Nikita Khrushchev, the erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly isolated leader who had once been Brezhnev's benefactor. By early autumn, the air in Moscow was thick with the scent of an impending storm. Khrushchev's harebrained schemes and his constant reshuffling of the party apparatus had alienated the very people who held the levers of the state. In the back of the Black Zeal, the conversations had shifted from policy to logistics. Brezhnev was no longer just listening to secrets. He was coordinating a strike. Alexander recalls the endless nocturnal journeys to Kutuzovsky Prospect, to the private apartments of the conspirators. These were the night sessions of the discontented, where the blueprint for the takeover was meticulously refined. The inner circle of the coup was a masterclass in political balance. There was Alexander Shelepin, the ambitious former head of the KGB, Nikolai Podgorny, the seasoned party organizer, and Mikhail Suslov, the gray cardinal and ideological gatekeeper. Brezhnev, however, was the indispensable glue that held this volatile coalition together. He was the only one who had the black files on everyone in the room, and the only one who had the unwavering loyalty of the men who drove the cars and guarded the doors. Alexander Rebenko's role during the night of October 13th, 1964, was that of the vital, invisible artery of the conspiracy. While Khrushchev was vacationing at his dacha in Pitsunda, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding in the capital, Moscow was being quietly rewired. Alexander spent 36 hours behind the wheel, acting as a high-speed courier between the conspirators. In an age before digital encryption, the only secure way to transmit a command was through a face-to-face whisper or a hand-delivered note. The driver recalls the eerie silence of the Moscow streets that night. There were no tanks on the corners, no soldiers in the squares. The coup was a bureaucratic masterpiece. Alexander drove Brezhnev to the Kremlin, entering through the Borovitsky Gate. He watched as his master stepped out, not with the frantic energy of a revolutionary, but with the heavy, deliberate calm of a man collecting a debt. Inside, the Presidium was meeting to seal Khrushchev's fate. The analytical value of this coup lies in its technology of seizure. Unlike the violent upheavals of the past, this was a takeover by consensus among the elite. Brezhnev had successfully convinced the various factions of the party, the military, and the KGB that Khrushchev was a threat to their collective stability. He used the very network of agents he had cultivated in Dnipropetrovsk and the Lubyanka to ensure that when the trap snapped shut, there was no way out. When Khrushchev was finally summoned back to Moscow to face his removal, he found that his phone lines were dead, his guards had been replaced, and his most trusted aides were now his jailers. The zenith of Brezhnev's power followed immediately after the fall of Khrushchev. Initially, the regime marketed itself as a return to collective leadership, a promise that no single man would ever again hold absolute authority. But Alexander Rebenko saw the reality within the car. One by one, the very allies who had helped Brezhnev seize power began to disappear from the inner circle. He witnessed the systematic neutralization of Alexander Shelepin, a man too clever and too ambitious for his own good. Brezhnev didn't arrest him. He simply eroded his base of power, move by calculated move, until Shelepin was relegated to the political wilderness. He saw the marginalization of Alexei Kosygin, the brilliant economic reformer, whose pragmatic ideas were slowly strangled by the bureaucracy Brezhnev had empowered. This was the birth of the system of personal devotion. Brezhnev realized that he didn't need the most talented men. He needed the most loyal ones. The car was now filled with the veterans, the old guard who owed their entire careers to him. This era saw the transformation of the Soviet leadership into a cult of stability, but it was a stability built on the suppression of any and all internal competition. It was during this period that the infamous cult of awards began to manifest. To the outside world, Brezhnev's obsession with medals, he would eventually hold over 100, was a sign of senile vanity. But from the driver's perspective, it was a strategic tool of patronage. Every medal given was a signal of favor. Every title bestowed was a tether of loyalty. The state became a giant reward system, where the currency was no longer achievement, but proximity to the General Secretary. The analytical takeaway is the concept of the triumph of the mediocre. By eliminating the brilliant and the ambitious, Brezhnev created a government that was perfectly stable, but utterly incapable of innovation. He had created a machine that could stay in power forever, but had no idea where to go. The invisible empire had become a golden cage. Alexander Rebenko recalls the transition of his master's personality during these years of absolute triumph. The hungry predator of the 50s and the sharp conspirator of the early 60s had become a man enamored with the theater of his own importance. He spent more time at his hunting lodges in Zavodivo than in his Kremlin office. The car, once a place of strategy, was now often a place of indulgence. Alexander would drive the General Secretary on high-speed races in his collection of foreign luxury cars, a fleet of Rolls-Royces and Cadillacs that were gifts from foreign leaders. These high-speed drives through the closed lanes of the Kutuzovsky Prospect were a metaphor for the regime itself, a powerful machine moving at a terrifying pace, but only within a protected artificial corridor, while the rest of the country stood still. Brezhnev felt untouchable. He had outmaneuvered every rival, silenced every critic, and turned the secret police into his personal household staff. But as we conclude this 5th chapter, the driver provides a chilling observation. In the very moment of his greatest triumph, the seeds of the final agony were being sown. The absolute power Brezhnev had secured meant that there was no one left to tell him the truth. The man who had built his career on the control of information was now being fed a diet of artificial reality by a circle of sycophants who were terrified of disturbing his peace. The coup of 1964 had been a masterpiece of political engineering, but it had created a leader who was no longer accountable to anything but his own fading health and his own growing delusions. The zenith of power was, in fact, the beginning of the end. Alexander Rebenko, watching the General Secretary doze off in the back seat of the car after a long hunting trip, realized that the empire was now on autopilot. The master of secrets had become a prisoner of his own success, and the road ahead was leading toward a slow pharmacological twilight from which there would be no return. The final decade of Leonid Brezhnev's reign was not a period of governance, but a slow-motion collapse into a pharmacological and neurological twilight. To the world, the Soviet Union remained a monolith of nuclear might and ideological certainty. But inside the Black Zeal, Alexander Rebenko was witnessing the physical and mental disintegration of the most powerful man in the Eastern Hemisphere. The era of stagnation was not just an economic or political term, it was a biological reality that the driver saw every single day in the reflection of his mirror. By the mid-1970s, the predator who had seized the Kremlin in a brilliant, bloodless coup had become a hollow shell. The heavy eyebrows, once a symbol of authority, now framed eyes that were often vacant and clouded by heavy sedation. Brezhnev's dependence on sleeping pills and tranquilizers, often secretly administered by his inner circle to keep him docile, had reached a critical level. Alexander Rebenko describes a scene of profound pathos. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, the man who held the launch codes for thousands of warheads, falling into a deep, drug-induced sleep in the middle of crucial negotiations with foreign heads of state. The driver recalls instances where he had to help the guards physically carry the limp leader from the car to his bed, the weight of the man feeling like the weight of the dying empire itself. Brezhnev's speech became slurred, his memory fractured, and his legendary tactical mind dissolved into a fog of confusion. The analytical value of this period is chilling. It presents the ultimate failure of the totalitarian model, a system so centralized and so dependent on a single figurehead that it could not acknowledge that figurehead was no longer capable of thinking. Because Brezhnev had spent decades eliminating any viable successors or critics, there was no mechanism to replace him. The invisible empire was now being managed by a council of regents, the elderly men of the Politburo who used the incapacitated leader as a human shield to maintain their own privileges. During these final years, the role of the driver shifted once again. Alexander was no longer a courier of conspiracies. He was a nurse, a guardian of a terrible secret, and a witness to the grotesque theater of late Brezhnevism. He watched as the state media used clever camera angles and edited recordings to present a leader who was still in command, while in reality, the man could barely stand without assistance. The gap between the official lie and the physical truth had become an abyss. The end came on the morning of November 10, 1982. Alexander Rebenko was on duty at the Zarekie 6 state dacha. The atmosphere was unusually heavy. When the doctors finally emerged from the general secretary's bedroom with ashen faces, the driver knew that the era had officially closed. But there was no time for mourning. The machinery of the state immediately pivoted from preservation to erasure. In the immediate wake of Brezhnev's death, Yuri Andropov, the former head of the KGB and the man who knew everyone's secrets, moved with terrifying speed. For Alexander Rebenko, this was the most dangerous moment of his life. He was the man who knew too much. He was the living archive of 30 years of Brezhnev's private deals, family scandals, and political crimes. He possessed the black files, not in a folder, but in his mind. For several months after the funeral, Alexander lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. He saw the Dnepropetrovsk clan being systematically dismantled. Galina Brezhneva was placed under effective house arrest, her diamond mafia associates sent to the gulags or executed. The protectors were gone, and the new master of the Kremlin, Andropov, was a man who did not believe in leaving loose ends. Rebenko was quietly retired and moved to a modest apartment, but the shadow of the Lubyanka never left him. He noticed the unmarked cars parked outside his home. He knew his phone was tapped. He understood that his survival depended entirely on his continued silence. He became a ghost again, fading into the gray background of a changing Moscow. He watched from a distance as the empire he had served began to fracture and finally dissolve in 1991. Throughout the decades of the post-Soviet era, as other officials published sanitized memoirs and sold their stories to Western journalists, Alexander remained silent. He kept his notebooks, meticulous handwritten records of dates, names, and locations, hidden in the floorboards of his apartment. He was waiting. He felt a profound, almost religious duty to history, but he also felt the weight of the blood oath he had signed in the subterranean levels of the KGB headquarters half a century ago. On November 13, 2024, at the age of 97, Alexander Rebenko finally decided that his final duty was not to the state that had unmade him, but to the truth that would outlast it. He realized that the phenomenon of silence had served its purpose for the masters, but now it was a disservice to the future. His testimony provides a devastating autopsy of power. He reveals that the Soviet collapse was not just the result of economic inefficiency or military overstretch, but a moral and psychological rot that started in the very car he drove. He shows us a leader who began as a sharp, pragmatic survivor and ended as a tragic, drug-addled symbol of a dead-end ideology. The story of the driver and his master is a publicistic legend that warns us about the nature of absolute power. It tells us that when a system is built on secrets and the suppression of the self, it eventually loses its grip on reality. The invisible man has finally spoken, and in doing so, he has stripped away the last layers of the Brezhnev myth. As the interview concludes, Rebenko looks at his hands, the hands that steered the course of history through the streets of Moscow for 30 years. He expresses no regret, only a quiet, somber clarity. He has fulfilled his final duty. The secret archives of the human heart are finally open. The silence is broken, the investigation is complete, and the ghost of the empire can finally be laid to rest. Leonid Brezhnev was not the titan the posters claimed he was, nor the buffoon the later jokes suggested. He was a man who conquered a world with secrets only to be buried by them in the end. And beside him, always, was the driver. The one person who saw it all, the one person who remembered everything, and the one person who finally dared to tell the truth.